Good evening from Rome. Good evening for the American Academy. My name is Avinoam Shalem, and I'm the director of the American Academy here in Rome. I'm very, very happy to welcome you all to this event, to our inside look at the American Academy affiliated excavation project, which will take us today to Gabii, to Porta Stabia at the Pompeii, and to the Contrada Agnese at Morgantina. My colleague, Lynn, who is the Mellon Professor at the American Academy here in Rome, will be the one to moderate this evening. So without much further ado, I pass the word to my colleague, Lynn. Here to you, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinoam. So welcome everyone to this mini session on the AAR affiliated excavations. Now, as many of you know, after World War II, the American Academy began to sponsor its own excavations, namely COSA under Frank Brown. But we no longer have the institutional resources to run such big digs, and that concept of the big dig will run through all of this today. So in order to help support American excavations, we've established a program of affiliated archaeological projects where we provide space for American teams to house limited numbers of finds and equipment, as well as a place for the teams to work on those finds, particularly off-season. One of the more important criteria for becoming and retaining the affiliated status is to publish regularly the activities and finds of the excavation. Now, normally the teams would submit a report to the Mellon Professor each year, but this year we received a generous grant from Bernard Fischer to support public programming in archaeology. So instead of simply receiving a written report, I've asked the three of the affiliated projects to provide a public presentation of their work and the progress to date. The projects are at different stages of development and completion, as you'll see. Another service that the AAR offered to these projects was to host an in-house workshop where they could get together and discuss common concerns. And this was becoming more and more difficult as the teams had different summer schedules. We just couldn't get everyone together at the American Academy at the same time. But I realized in this new Zoom world that we live in, we no longer have to gather in the same place. So after the presentations of each team, they will have a discussion regarding some of the issues that they and others are dealing with both during these COVID times, but also during the current period of rapid changes in technology. And so the idea is to let people have a glimpse behind the scenes of what archaeological teams are dealing with these days. So we have three teams with us today. Nicola Terrenato and Lara Banducci will speak to us about excavation at Gabii, which is currently the largest American project in Italy and is ongoing. Then we'll hear from Stephen Ellis and Allison Emerson about the excavation at Porta Stabia in Pompeii, which is now completed excavation and is in publication phase. Finally, Alex Walthall and Anne Truetzel will give us a glimpse into the ongoing excavation at Contrada Agnese at Morgantina in Sicily, which of course, Morgantina is a longtime American excavation site. So the projects will be presented in this order, and I'll introduce the two representatives of each project before they speak. And then after each presentation, there'll be a bit of time for questions, and you can write those in the Q&A, the button at the bottom of the screen. So we will start with Nick Terrenato and Lara Banducci at Gabii. Nick, who is the director of Gabii, is the Esther V. Van Diemen Collegiate Professor of Roman Studies at the University of Michigan. Since 2020, he's also directed the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. He studied at Rome and Pisa, and he specializes in first millennium BCE Italy, and particularly in early Rome, northern Etruria, and the Roman conquest. In addition to the Gabii project, he also directs the project at Santo Mobono And his other interests include theories of state and empire formation, field survey, and history of archaeology. He recently published Early Roman Expansion with Cambridge University Press in 2019, which won the 2021 AIA Wiseman Book Award. Lara Banducci, the director of finds at Gabii, is an associate professor in the Department of Greek and Roman Studies at Carleton University. Her research is grounded in the idea that an individual's daily behavior, as reflected by the material record, can provide important insights into large-scale societal changes in the ancient world. She's currently completing a book that investigates the foodways of several sites in central Italy. Lara also co-directs the Capturing the Life Cycle of Ceramics in Rome project, teaming with colleagues from University of Missouri, University of Glasgow, and the University of Burgundy, Franche-Comté in France. And so now I will turn it over to you guys.
All right, I hope you can all hear me. So yes, Gabii and Big Digs. I will provide a very brief introduction on the sort of overall conception of the project, and then pass on to Lara for much more detailed information about what is going on right now. So the Guppy Project, and Big Digs, as Lynn was saying, and thank you so much for this opportunity and this, great event. So first of all, I'd like to say that, this is a collective endeavor, and that the Guppy Project is actually run by a committee of directors that include Lara Banducci and Anna Galone, Andrew Johnson, Marcello Magetta, Rachel Opitz, and myself. And it's actually, the team, as you can see up there, that was our last full season in 2019 before our world imploded. And this is the staff list, which, as you can see, is long and complicated. These are all the various staff members. It is unashamedly a big dig. This is a view from the air, but both in terms of the areas that are under excavation and in terms of the logistical area and the various infrastructure that we created over the years. I want to go back very briefly here to a review article by Greg Wolf on the Journal of Roman Archaeology that was criticizing, among other things, Big Digs. And these were some of the key points that Greg, who's a good friend and a very smart person, was making at the time. And that definitely had an impact on the conception of the Guppy Project, that Big Digs were and here he was thinking about those decade-long projects, especially in Greece, Turkey, and elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, that has, some of which have been ongoing for more than 100 years, as we know. And he was saying that they are too empirical and not hypothesis-driven. In other words, that there is no clear research question behind them other than saying, I wonder what's here, that they could be methodologically stagnant, as in, methodologies from, say, the 1950s could still be used in because of consistency of keeping records, consistent, that they could be slow to publish, they could have series of volumes that would take forever to come out. And they would have to come out in a certain order, and you could be stuck behind somebody who was in publishing, that they could be very hierarchical and cliquey. We all, if in our world, we all know what a schoolie is, right? That they, very importantly, that they, many of them were neo-colonial in their conception, in that they really did not worry too much about the impact that we're making on the local cultural scene, and what, the balance of power was that was implicit in their work, and that they were stifling new interpretation, as in, the founding father of the excavation had come up with a certain interpretation in the 1930s, and people would be loath to contradict that it had taken on its own life. So all these points that would be, of course, far too long to discuss in detail, but perhaps can, be, it was useful for all to have right at the beginning of the event. They were all, as I said, in the back of our minds as we were thinking about a new excavation. So, for instance, in terms of saying that big digs are not hypothesis driven, well, ours was in that, and very explicitly so. That is to say that, there's really started with people, me and others, who were really interested in what we like to call the embryology of the Roman city. We wanted to explore the formation process of the city because, you could argue that, we know very well the mature individual of the Roman city. We know, of course, there's always more to know, but the full-fledged Roman city is fairly well known to us, and it's surprising how little we know on how you get there. So, as a provocation, I often say, well, describe to me what Roman Forum would look like in 200 BCE, and there is no answer to that because we don't know. And so, such a basic fundamental thing as to the Roman Forum is, of course, we know very well, we have dozens and dozens of examples from the late Republic and early imperial period, but none, really zero, from the earlier periods. And this is true of many other things. So we wanted to have a site that would allow us, among other things, it wouldn't be the only, but that as one key element would allow us to explore these early phases. And the real obstacle to understanding better these early phases is not only that they're not very monumental, but most importantly, that they have a ton of monumental stuff on top. Meaning that, for instance, if you dig in Rome, like I've done for a couple of decades, what happens is that you find archaic Rome in the tiny little sliver of space where there aren't all the, the later stuff from late Republican foundations all the way to early modern and even, fascist deep foundations. And so hence our knowledge is extremely fragmentary. At a place like Gabii, on the other hand, there was a great opportunity, and the great opportunity was connected with the fact that, having trouble changing slides, was connected with the fact that the city had not done well after about 100 BCE. For reasons that would be too long to discuss here, this is a city that all but peters out before the great monumental developments of the late Republic and the early Empire. This is a place that has no Colosseum and even less, medieval or Renaissance churches sitting on top of the earlier stuff. In fact, when we got there, it was a beautiful, golf course. There was, some excavations that superintendents had done, and then everything else was just former pasture land that had become part, conveniently, of a archaeological park, where honestly you couldn't see much. And so this is what you see here is top left, the city in the archaic period, say around maybe 500 BCE, and bottom, the shaded part is what is left of Gabii, by say, 50 BCE. And so you can see that, of course, there are areas where there is a big superimposition still. And of course, Lara will talk about those. And that's great because we want the full chronological span, but at the same time, you also have large areas, all the areas that are not shaded in the bottom plan, where you can actually see you get land directly on the Middle Republican and archaic and even Iron Age stuff, which is precisely what has happened. So there was an hypothesis. There was what some archaeologists call a deposit model, so a modeling of how the deposit would work. And surprisingly, because these things are often things turn out to be radically different, they worked out reasonably well. So we are in the process of checking a number of boxes that we had opened up when the excavation was begun over 10 years ago. At the same time, as it always happens, a host of new questions and new discoveries were made. And we've tried to update our methodology while keeping it consistent, which is a bit of a paradox, but we think it's possible. We have tried to create as polyphonic an environment as possible, that is to say, and one where research proceeds, by parallel lines rather than sequentially. So there is no sense that A necessarily has to come after B, but people can just run with whatever idea or data set they want to work with, which has produced what we believe to be a very healthy and diverse publication and less hierarchical publication record. I'm almost out of time, but these are some of the areas that have been excavated, and Area B has already been published in full as an online volume, and a big effort has gone into publishing now as a second volume Area A and the late parts of Area B. Along this conceptual structure were of stratified texts, which again would be long to go into detail, but hopefully Laura will have some time to expand on. So that's all for me, and thank you very much.
Okay. Does my screen look all okay?
It does.
Okay. So thank you very much. So I wanted to take my time to give just a snippet of some of our results. As you can see, we excavate a very large area, and there's a lot of, as Nick said, a lot of parallel study and publication happening. And so this is sort of the most complete of those projects, all of this, and this is forthcoming work. So areas A and B of our excavations shed light on our understanding of Gabii's experiment with urban life and on the transformations witnessed by the later urban center, as Nick alluded to. And this is what we might call the deurbanization of the city. So here I'm summarizing the earliest occupation phases of this excavation block, and then I focus on the imperial quarry and necropolis, which covered the same area. I'm illustrating some of these features using examples from our 3D model of the excavation area. This is built from photogrammetric models on a Unity 3D game engine. So this model will be released coming in October 2021 in volume 2 of the Gabii publication series, A Cemetery and a Quarry from Imperial Gabii, which I have edited together with Anna Galone, and this is through the University of Michigan Press. The excavation of this area of the site took place from 2009 to 2011. So the quality of the photo models of individual features reflects the state of the art at that time. But the interface that has been built by our colleague Tyler Johnson reflects our current state of the art and our current thinking in terms of data accessibility and display. So here you can see clicking on individual trowels, which represent access to the polygons of individual stratigraphic units. And then you're able to access all of the database online. And here we have a mini map where we click through individual phase plans of every single phase of this area in order to orient the user as they navigate through this interactive model. So to begin in Area A, it has been possible to identify the remains of the first occupation of this sector of Gabii. In the 8th century BCE, there were at least 2 huts based on the post-hole evidence, the first slightly earlier than the other. It's possible to reconstruct the outline of the first hut as an elliptical or oval shape located in the northern sector of the area. And the presence of 2 infant burials can also be used to infer the existence of these huts. The burials are dated to glacial period 3B and 4A respectively, and are thus roughly 1 century apart from one another. The tombs of Area A, evidence of a well-attested practice of burying infants within domestic contexts in Iron Age Latium, are also an indicator of the status of the local inhabitants and their place within this socially stratified society. The chronological difference between these 2 burials tells us that the hut settlement here was an elite group, which was well established in the community since the practice of rich burial appears through multiple generations. The members of this group transformed a sad but common event like a child's death into an opportunity to reinforce and display their social status. All the evidence of the hut settlement was swept away when the area underwent a thorough reorganization. In the 6th century BCE, new linear cuts were created in the outcropping bedrock, and these cuts were for channeling the rainwater away from domestic structures, unfortunately not preserved, but hinted at based on the building in the following phase. Alternatively, the cuts may also suggest the presence of fencing or precinct walls delimiting a new habitation unit. Their regularity and linearity suggest the reorganization of the space as part of a process that led to the transformation of the round huts into buildings with straight walls. And in the Republican period, we see the footprint of a rectangular structure with traces of the archaic structure underneath it, now in line with a major road running roughly north-south. This rectangular structure in Area A, probably a house, seems to have been built by the 3rd century BCE and underwent a few phases of minor renovations. It was a smaller version of a nearby house in Area B, previously published in the volume A Mid-Republican House from Gabii. At the end of the Republican period, both of the houses occupying the city blocks of Areas A and B went out of use, and the block was left vacant. Soon after the abandonment of the houses and subsequent robbing and dumping activities, the extraction of the bedrock from underneath these features began. The rock, a type of tuff known as lapis gabinus, has long been recognized as an important building material in Rome during the late Republican and Augustan periods. Evidence for quarrying activities has been noted throughout Gabii in visible outcrops along the Castiglione crater, as well as within the settlement areas. And in the case of areas A and B, where the bedrock is quite high and close to the surface, the stone was in an optimal position to be exploited, though it lay within a formerly inhabited area. There were 2 quarries, a field of debris from quarrying activities, quarry trial pits, and several cuts in the bedrock, which are clearly from the extraction of rectilinear blocks. It seems that the large northern quarry pit in Area A came into use in the mid-1st century CE and was followed in the same phase by a seemingly smaller quarry further down the slope to the southeast. The full depth and extent of this smaller quarry are unknown since it was filled with rocky debris and unable to be completely excavated. By the last quarter of the 1st century CE, the quarrying activity ceased in this southern section of the block. These intramural quarries to exploit the local bedrock before a settlement was established, this has precedence elsewhere in Italy, and also common, of course, was the use of stone from shrinking cities in the form of spoliation of the standing remains. However, stone extraction of bedrock from around and under standing structures is quite rare. It necessitates that the locals were comfortable with surrendering part of the town to the physical dangers, sounds, and dusts which quarrying inevitably involved. And a similar change can be attributed to the necropolis, which is roughly contemporary. So this necropolis was established next to the smaller of the 2 quarries and stretched 1,000 meters square across the whole city block. The burial activity can be divided into 3 subphases with a total of 30 inhumations. And these phases span a chronological range of about 150 years from the 1st century CE and ending in the 2nd century. The necropolis was delimited, at least originally, by the partially visible decaying walls of the underlying mid-Republican house of Area B. The majority of the tombs are concentrated within the house's underlying boundaries and oriented in the same manner as the house's walls down the slope. In any given phase, the spacing between the tombs is quite irregular, ranging from 1 to 2 meters, yet the overall effect of the 3 phases together creates the impression of a relatively regular layout of a main row of tombs running down the gradual slope and two shorter rows of tombs on either side. For the tombs in the earliest subphases, all of them had either well-preserved coverings of tiles or strong evidence for their original use. These tile coverings are all positioned to form a pitched roof termed tomba cappuccina in the Italian archaeological literature. Employing reused building materials rather than purpose-built sarcophagi suggests that the deceased population here was not wealthy. At the same time, an effort to protect the body with elaborate pitched roof means that a certain amount of care was taken to mark and protect these bodies from disturbance, perhaps helping to fulfill the requirements of a proper burial. In 3 instances, sheets of lead were also involved in the burial of the bodies of this necropolis. So this here is a feature of the 3D model, which we call tomb mode, allowing the burial essentially to be re-excavated. So tomb 34 here contained an adult female. The body was deposited on a rectangular sheet of lead. It was then covered by 6 terracotta tiles, and the terracotta roof was then covered by 2 more sheets of lead. All of the stratigraphic units here can be made visible, as we see, or turned off. And they are all linked to the online database with more details. So this reflects our first steps in allowing the user to interact with the complex stratigraphy at the site using our 3D models. And future publications will have 3D models of every single stratigraphic unit on site. The necropolis itself should be considered unconventional, if not exceptional, for its location. It lays within a city block, formerly a residential area, very close to the city's geographic center and adjacent to a large public monumental structure of the Republican era, located in Area F. In 5th century BCE Rome, the 12 tables outlawed the burial or burning of bodies within the city limit. For towns outside of Rome, the late Republican Lex Orsonensis seems to have also restated this same restriction. In urban contexts in Italy, we have very few examples of adult burials inside city walls, while necropolis extending outside the city are common. The location of the Area AB necropolis is especially interesting when we note that the people burying the deceased here could not have been ignorant of the earlier use of this area. So in tomb 23, shown here, for example, we can click on this icon and enter tomb view. And have a look at this. So this is rough-hewn stone covering reused roof tiles to create this cappuccino roof. You can then remove. So here we see the head of the deceased individual is nestled between the wall blocks of the earlier house. So this reveals that the area was known to have been inhabited in an earlier period. Thus, the people who lived at Gabii no longer considered this block to be part of the city. While a broader assessment of Gabii's status in the middle to late imperial period awaits completion and publication of the areas surrounding the area in question here, we can make some preliminary observations. In the period contemporary to the necropolis, to the east in Area F, a formerly monumental public space was partially infilled and subdivided into smaller rooms. And along its street front, shops took over the spaces between the monumental pilasters of the earlier building, and small-scale industrial activities took over in back. Activity in these shops along the roadside continued until at least the 2nd century CE. To the west of our necropolis in Area D, there is no evidence of any activity in the imperial period. It was an empty lot. Further to the east in Area F, there is evidence for small-scale industrial activity. While in Area I, there's a relatively large-scale residence of some sort of, and some sort of agricultural facility, which persisted into late antiquity. These later activities, both in Area C and I, much like Area F, are located along the street front of Gabii's main trunk road, several meters downslope from Areas A and B. Thus, after about 500 years, Gabii began to undergo intra-site abandonment, where areas previously within the city were neither inhabited physically nor, crucially, conceived of to be part of the city by the locals. The whole settlement seems to have shifted downslope, focusing on the trunk road. In Roman archaeology, much has been made about the location of cemeteries just outside urban spaces and how these cemeteries were cities of the dead. Here, the dead claimed and advertised identity through their funerary monuments, and the living interacted with the dead and with each other through the maintenance and visitation of the tombs. Yet the importance of the spatial distinctions between the living and the dead may have been overstated. At Gabii, the different statuses of the patchwork of blocks considered in the city and out of the city would have been less jarring to the average passerby when we consider the blurry limits of many ancient cities. Even though cemeteries were typically outside the city's official limits, they were often not marked or blocked off from the roadside, nor from the suburban settlement around the city. Rather, they existed in a liminal space, perhaps technically outside some acknowledged limit defined by a pomerium or wall, but still surrounded by living people. Dionysius of Halicarnassus describes the city of Rome's suburban sprawl in the Augustan period, commenting that it was impossible to see where the city ended and where the countryside began. So at Gabii, passing through one block, a necropolis of sacred space for the dead, to another, an abandoned lot, to another, a row of lively shops, might have fallen within the realm of normalcy at this time. Gabii's unincorporation of at least some parts of the urban area, or a shift in their legal or religious status to facilitate the needs of the local population, was underway definitively in the 1st century CE. The importance of these changes should be emphasized, as should the early date at which this deurbanization seemed to have happened here. So we definitely need to thank my co-editor, Anna Galona, as well as all of the contributors to the research inherent in this volume, as well as the people responsible for the visual production here, the maps by Matt Naglack and the 3D model by Tyler Johnson, as well as thanking, of course, all of our sponsors in Italy and in the US.
Thank you, Nick and Lara. So, so if you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the question and answer. We already have one from John Bodell. Thank you both. Lara, what purpose do you think the lead sheets served in the Cappuccino burials?
Right, they served, so we have 3 people buried in lead. I don't know how much I want to reveal about DNA here. We'll just leave that for the next publications. We have 3 people buried in lead in various ways. All of the lead seems to be of a very similar style, similar thickness in sheeting, but this is all reused lead sheets or lead boxes. And this is where Anna Galona's research comes in our forthcoming publication. It seems to be sort of lead of an industrial waste, for example, for basins or cisterns associated with the aqueduct whose location we do not know, but something of that nature. So certainly it served to distinguish these 3 individuals. Other than that, we don't, I'm happy to hear other particular ideas. The 3 lead burials are all within the phasing of the rest of this necropolis. So it's not like they came earlier or later, or particularly distinct in that way.
The next question, I think you've answered this. Where did they get the lead? Though I don't know if this person wants to know whether you've tested it to find the original origin, or, I mean, you said that it probably came from local aqueducts or water structures.
Yeah, based on the shape of the most whole piece, that is this famous lead burrito. If you want to Google lead burrito, you'll find him. The whole piece is basically a lead wrapping around one individual. That's tomb 8, and it looks to be a squished box. And so that's why we think it's sort of a piece of probably water containment, a container like that, but sort of human scale, 6 feet long.
So I have my own question. In the 6th century, when the oval hut was replaced, what was the material that rectangular structure was made of, and did they make use of the local stone that was later quarried?
So we don't have evidence of the 6th century building in terms of its structure. We only have evidence of the fact that there were we have evidence of the fact that there were channels filled with 6th century pottery that are channels that are completely in line with the later Republican house structure. So that's what makes us think that the Republican house is sitting on an earlier rectilinear building. And we also have contemporary rectilinear buildings from Area D. So it's sort of the switch from both Area D and Area A had huts, circular elliptical huts. Both of them then must have had a phase of rectilinear building, maybe with a stone socle and mud brick on top, we don't know. And then at least Area A has this Republican rectilinear building. Yeah.
So we've got a question here that might be actually more appropriate for afterwards. It's how many years does an excavation need to qualify as a big dig? Some sites are huge, particularly in Greece at Corinth and Agora. Do you stop simply because it has gotten too big? I think rather than answer that now, it's a really good topic for the discussion afterwards. And let's see, one more question. I'm interested in the long-term hosting of the online publications and the interactive database. Who's in charge of the maintenance and curation of the site?
Yeah, I think Nick can answer this because this has to do with our relationship with the University of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a absolutely fundamental question. Of course, it poses a problem, like it always is for online publication, because it's not easy to predict what's going to be still there, say 100 years from now. Certainly not a commercial publisher, not necessarily an internet provider or anything else. And also it ties in with issues of discoverability. So the path that we've chosen in collaboration with Michigan University Press and with the library at the University of Michigan is, well, first of all, to have these publications as proper publication with ISBN numbers, cataloged by LOC and so on and so forth, and then hosted by the library at the University of Michigan, which, on the whole, if you were to bet that, there was going to be something called the University of Michigan 100 years from now, it's going to have a library, that's probably a safest bet than most others we felt. And here the issue is particularly complex because, of course, it's not just an issue of a dead repository, but of dynamic database and 3D environments that need to continue to be served. And every time that there is an update in the in the operating systems or the hardware, you need to keep updating that. And the library at University of Michigan, which after all, libraries are in the business of preserving knowledge, has taken on this burden to carry forward. So every time that this is connected with a format that was developed, across various institutions, there was a consortium of institutions that developed a protocol called Fulcrum, and the commitment that they collectively made is that they will continue serving Fulcrum, in all the future platforms that will emerge. But yes, it's not enough to put something online, of course, and create a website. It's these questions are incredibly difficult to solve, and this is how we try to solve it.
Thanks, Nick. I think we probably should move on to Pompeii now. And so we're going over to Stephen Ellis and Allison Emerson. Stephen Ellis, director of the Porta Stabia project, is an associate professor in the classics department at University of Cincinnati. And his research activities and publications spring from his interest in ancient cities and urban life. In addition to the Porta Stabia project, he directs University of Cincinnati's new excavation at Tharos on Sardinia. And he also co-directs with Eric Poehler the Pompeii Quadriporticus project, and then with Tim Gregory, the East Isthmia project in Greece. In 2011, he edited The Making of Pompeii, Studies in the History and Urban Development of an Ancient City. And in 2018, he published The Roman Retail Revolution with Oxford University Press. And finally, Stephen is a 2013 Rome Prize Fellow at the AAR. Allison Emerson, field director of the project, is assistant professor in the Department of Classical Studies at Tulane. And she is especially interested in marginal areas and activities of ancient cities like waste management and the treatment of the dead. Her first book, Life and Death in the Roman Suburb, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And she is co-editor of a volume of the Porta Stabia excavation report, which is currently under review. And Allison is a 2018 Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies and a 2019 Fellow of the AAR. And she was among my first cohort as Mellon Professor. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Let me get.
So Stephen, let me just say that Stephen is actually in a hotel room at Pompeii. And so if he fades a little bit, that's why. We suggested that he should just take his phone and go down to the site and give it from the site. But
Yeah, I really probably should have. Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, so if things do go a little bit pear-shaped, I think Allison will just sort of kick me off and jump in and take over from there. I think in the interest of time, I'll just be as kind of brief as possible with a, excuse me, a background and introduction to the project. And then Allison will do some of the heavier lifting on sort of some of the results and sort of where we're going with the publication process. So as a project, it is clearly it's an urban excavation. And in terms of, I'm not sure where we fit in the scale of big digs, but in terms of the scale of Pompeian excavations, it's quite a large project in that we focused in on 2 town blocks of houses and shops and workshops, ostensibly a kind of a sub-elite, or what we thought going into it was effectively a sub-elite neighborhood. So this is not the coffee table book version of Pompeii with large, lavishly decorated houses with wall paintings and mosaics, etc., but rather shops and restaurants and bars and taverns and that kind of thing. Before moving in to sort of look at the area in detail, I do want to give a nod, first of all, to the kind of the coordinated team effort. So here we'll have sort of Allison and I speaking today, whatever time it is, wherever we are. But we really are just kind of spokespeople for a rather large project with some really great people who've made some extraordinary contributions to the work. So I want to give a nod to them at the outset. What they've all been working on is, as I say, this neighborhood, and this is where my internet might start to get a little bit fuzzy because I'm going to start to zoom in now on what is the Porta Stabia neighborhood. It is this area down near the so-called entertainment district, just inside the Porta Stabia itself. So 2 town blocks, as I mentioned before, with about kind of 20 different sort of entrances coming in off this main street into buildings are about 10 or 11 individual properties that we have here. So over the years, we began in 2005 and then had, I think it was 8 seasons of excavations. And then have been working since then on the publication process. So there's also a conversation to be had there, perhaps, about how that kind of system works. So as I say, we had 8 years of excavations. We opened up about 40 trenches across the site. We didn't, of course, excavate every square inch of the site, but they were effectively kind of targeted strategic locations for these excavations based on the sort of building knowledge of the standing architecture and our work on the architecture, particularly with Eric Paler, to sort of guiding us as to where to target these trenches for the most valuable information. We, of course, find lots of artifacts. And so these slides are really just to kind of give a sense of the scale of the project. So we dug a lot, which meant that we found a lot, some 10,000 or so artifacts that we've been looking at. And that's been work that is coming towards a close now, thanks to the work, the effort of Dr. Lee Lieberman and Dr. Catherine Baker, who are heading that volume of the publication. We also have, of course, lots of pottery. So, you know, some, I think the number's probably bigger than that right now. But in any case, lots of pottery led by Dr. Archer Martin, who's no stranger of the American Academy in Rome. And then also an enormous bioarchaeological record as well that's been really important for our work in trying to think through, of course, not just the environment in which this neighborhood operated, but also elements of questions about diet, trade, procurement of sort of different being led by Mark Robinson of Oxford. So essentially what all this means is we have this sort of, at a glance, we have this enormous record, and it's really easy, I think, for archaeological projects, I think increasingly easy for archaeological projects these days to sort of celebrate in the big numbers that we get from these data sets. And of course, you need big data sets to ask the bigger questions. On the one hand, and on the other hand, it's important also to, and I think this is what the three projects will demonstrate today, is just the importance of sort of weaving these into not just a narrative, but also to be guided by different kinds of questions as well. So the questions that really guided our project from the start were really around thinking about not necessarily kind of specific questions, but kind of umbrella questions. And so one of them was effectively the social making of the city. So here we were thinking about the livelihoods of the individuals, the family networks, the groups, in a kind of a socio-economic sense. So thinking about relationships between buildings and between properties. We'll talk a bit more about that coming up tonight. But also, as well as the social making of these properties and this sort of neighborhood, we're also interested in then the structural making of it as well. So thinking about the taphonomic conditions of why things are there, right? Why do we find the certain objects that we find, where we find them, and when we find them? But also really interested there in themes and ideas and questions of infrastructure as well. So when we talk about the sort of the making of the site, we're thinking here about this kind of volumetric matrix of the city. So all of that physical volume, how does it get it there? How does it operate? This is really leading me to sort of the final point I want to make before handing it over to Allison, which is that what we're really trying to do is to kind of also not just look at the social and structural making, but also the kind of contextual place of Pompeii and of our project and of the site that we're looking at. So sort of pulling out a bit from the sort of the microstratigraphy of each trench, pulling out from connections between one trench and a nearby trench or a neighboring trench, and even pulling out beyond looking at one room to the next room or one property to the next, and trying to sort of pull out, as this kind of this drone video shows, to try to sort of connect the site to the broader urban landscape of Pompeii, and then really ideally further beyond even further still. So this is really just trying to give a sense of the scale of not just the project that we're working on, but kind of the scale of the site in which we're operating, and the importance of being able to sort of make those connections, or try to find ways of making connections between these sort of really detailed data sets and bigger stories and narratives that we can start to weave together. So with that, I'm not sure if any of that came through. Over to Dr. Allison Emerson, who hopefully has better internet than I do. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Yes, thank you, Stephen. So I just wanted to pick up right where Stephen left off on this issue of complexity, because we are working across, as Stephen said, 40 trenches, 2 city blocks, maybe 10 or 11 separate buildings. We were working in trenches since we are in many ways restricted by the architecture of Pompeii. Of course, we have big walls standing throughout our site, which requires us to adapt maybe away from the open air excavation that we've just seen at Gabii, and to work in targeted trenches instead. So one of the things that we really first have to do in making sense of all of this complexity and making sense of all of this noise of a project at this scale was figure out how to envision this and present it in a way that others could read. And maybe when you look at this slide, you're thinking, what, I cannot read this at all. It's so much gobbledygook and so many numbers. But basically what we're looking at here is our site-wide Harris matrix, with each of these boxes representing a phase that then ties back to a Harris matrix presenting all of the stratigraphy within one trench. So if we look at, in this case, 17.4b, we're looking at phase 4b of one trench, trench 17. Putting together all of this has been really the key process of our work, and this is going to be the primary evidence that we present in the first volume of the publication. So this project is currently being published in a series of 4 volumes by Oxford University Press, and this information, the stratigraphic and architectural information, will make up the first volume, as well as kind of the overall story of the site. And what we're looking at here is really through all of this gobbledygook and all these bits of numbers, this is the story of the Porta Stabia from its earliest human history to the eruption of Vesuvius. And just to make that a little clearer, we can cut away a lot of those numbers that don't really matter at this point. And what we have are really 7 phases of occupation here, with an 8th phase that comes of modern activity following the eruption of 79. So human activity here begins in the 6th century, when we have some scattered architecture in big blocks of very soft volcanic material local to the site of the so-called Papamonte. We have, in this earliest phase, evidence for architecture to either side of a packed earth road that basically follows the same alignment as the later Via Stabiana. So we're already starting to see some of the layout of this kind of proto-city at this time. In this, as you'll see, we have actually split into 3 kind of sub-phases within our phase 1, because we also had what's common across the city of Pompeii, a hiatus in the 5th century where we really don't see activity. And as I said, this is common across the site. It's also something that we're still figuring out. In the 4th century, we get a new activity, a lot of activity that is kind of reutilizing earlier architecture, cutting it apart, making new buildings. But where things really get started, because we're missing a lot of that, there's a lot of later quarrying here, later construction activity that takes that away. So really where we start to get evidence is in phase 2. When we see the beginnings of what's going to define this area over the next several hundred years, which is manufacturing. So in phase 2, we have a ceramics workshop and other production activities, including what we now know was salted fish production already back in the 2nd century. In the next phase, our phase 3, we get the construction of the first buildings that would still be standing in 79, and continuing production in phase 4. More of the buildings, really all of the buildings that would be there in 79 are there by phase 4, in which the front rooms, at least of all, are dedicated to fish salting. Phase 5, we're going to come back to. This is the Augustan and early imperial age, in which we get a major transformation. And then really phases 6 and 7, things just continue on from phase 5. And there's something interesting even in that. Now today, because summarizing 4 volumes of information and 15 years of research in 10 minutes is a little tough. Today, instead of the whole cake, we'll have a couple of little bonbons pulling out some of the themes that Stephen had already brought up. And I think focusing in on this phase, phase 5, our early imperial phase, is the one that can really emphasize some of these themes. So this is a moment where we don't just see development in this neighborhood. We don't just see the neighborhood growing or changing in small ways, but we really see a transformation of this neighborhood from buildings that were primarily devoted to manufacturing to buildings that were devoted to retail of objects that had been manufactured elsewhere. And the biggest change there is that we see a shift from fish salting and creating fish salted products, almost certainly including garum, but others as well, to retailing, especially in hospitality. So retailing of food, retailing of places to stay and places to eat. So in this period, we see all of these vats, which are pictured on the screen in various phases of excavation. All of these vats that had once really dominated the street front at the Porta Stabia, used to create salted fish products, get filled in, and these rooms that they were once in devoted to retail. They become shops with big wide doorways to welcome people in. Some of them become bars with masonry counters. Here we see a masonry counter set on top of a filled and here partially excavated vat. This change is really interesting for a few reasons. So coming back to the point of context, this is a change that lets us contextualize not just this neighborhood to say, okay, well, we know from a variety of sources, including the literary record, that Pompeii was known for its garum production. We can say here, okay, this little neighborhood, which we thought of as kind of sub-elite, unimportant buildings, is part of the economy of this town, of the city. But we can actually look a lot bigger than that to think about the role of Pompeii's economy in the Italian economy and even across the Mediterranean world, because of course the moment that we see all these vats going out is also the moment when we see a lot of garum start to come in to Italy, especially from Spain, at which point it seems that these properties of the Porta Stabia, the property owners say, okay, well, this is no longer working. Let's devote these spaces to something else, to retail, and our salted fish is most likely moving elsewhere because we know that Pompeii is still known for its salted fish in 79. So that's one point, one bonbon of contextualization. But this also gives us context about the city because big changes in Pompeii have tended to be associated with a major event, that is the earthquake that came about 17 years before the eruption of Vesuvius. So often in the history of Pompeian studies, if there has been a major change, it's been tied to that earthquake. And this is a common story that is still told in Pompeii, that spaces become more retail driven after the earthquake that happened in 62 or 63 AD. Here we can say that's actually not the case whatsoever in this neighborhood. We see these changes tied to something much larger, which are the economic networks of the Roman world. The earthquake really doesn't make much change here at all. A lot of walls fell down, but the people who lived there just kind of pick up the stones, put them back in the wall, and keep going. Phase 5 also gives us some interesting little nuggets about the structural making of Pompeii, about what this city is made out of. Because as you can see from these graphs on the screen, Phase 5 gives us the majority of all of our finds. So these are the non-ceramic small finds. And many of these finds, and these finds include, and these numbers are definitely boosted by the coins, so I don't know how well you can read it, but that lower graph are the coins by phase. We have a huge number of coins that are coming from Phase 5. At one level, this makes perfect sense. These spaces, these buildings are devoted to retail in Phase 5. So we might expect to have a lot of coins or even other things like dice that sort of make sense in this kind of bar environment. But when we really look at where those finds are coming from, we find that they're not on the floors. They're not even kind of in the floors, as in they've been, you know, someone was walking around and kind of trod the coin down into the floor. They're in the floors, as in they're part of the construction material that makes up the floors. And in that case, they seem to have very little to do with the spaces where they were found. So even if we find things that make sense in, say, a shop or a bar, like coins or dice, we're also finding things that really don't make sense, like big pieces of terracotta decoration that are clearly coming from large, well-decorated public buildings. And those are found, as this picture shows, right alongside other types of trash, like bits of ceramic sherds and animal bones. So really what we discovered as we worked on this, another key finding, was that the finds are related in the vast majority of cases, as you can see here, more than 90% of cases, related to the creation or construction of the area of the room of the building and not actually to the use of it. And this has been really important for understanding the structure of the site, but also for understanding things like waste management in Pompeii and how garbage is being used and reused in this city. And finally, real quick, on a note on the social making of the city, Phase 5 also gives us, as I said, kind of the final organization of these buildings, which you can see here. And when we first approached this site, we were really thinking of it in terms of trying to bring a finer mesh to understanding lower class areas of Pompeii. So some of our research goals were to understand these different buildings as separate properties and to try and trace kind of which win and which lose, which take over space, which lose space. Are there differences in what people are eating in the different properties, what people are throwing away? But we've found that as we work more and more with this data, that this actually doesn't seem to be what's happening, because instead we're seeing collaboration between these properties. Instead, we're seeing properties that not only, say, replicate plans, as we might notice here or up here, but also share resources. So in this building, we have a large quarry that's used to quarry out materials, some of which go into the walls of this building as it's being expanded, but the vast majority of which are used to construct the building next door. Or back here, we have a little cesspit right here that's shared between two neighboring properties throughout the entire history of their establishment. Other places, we have wells that are shared between properties, even a public well that gets kind of privatized into this property on the corner, but even so maintains open doorways from which somebody could still access the well from the street. So we've started thinking less in terms of kind of understanding these as separate spaces to understanding this neighborhood as a whole, how it works as a neighborhood. And part of that comes with knowing that although these spaces would have been used by a lot of very different people, we're really facing more and more that the owners of these spaces, probably many of them had shared ownership. So for example, like these large garden dining restaurants are all interconnected throughout their entire histories. We're seeing maybe what we're looking at here is actually elite ownership, and potentially even elite ownership of individuals who don't even live in Pompeii. So oh no, sorry, I'm bad with running the videos. There we go. As a final point, as we watch this video, which is going to bring our site to life, in this quick, just 10 minutes, one thing that can happen, I think, if we look at a site like this, which is very complex, and here it is, and it's digital reconstruction, I should say, an entirely accurate digital reconstruction, not just an artist rendering, but this is completely based on our architectural survey, our total station survey, and even there are some fun little Easter eggs in here. And this building is later than these, so it has a slightly different color stucco. We have amphorae that were actually found in the buildings, cups that were manufactured out behind this building on the table. So we've tried to make this our neighborhood as much as we can. But one of the things I want to emphasize that I think can get lost in a really quick presentation is that as we face all of this complexity, as we face all of this data, it can be tempting to smooth it to such a degree that it looks clean and it looks neat. And what I like about this reconstruction is that it's not clean, it's not neat. The city that we're working on wasn't clean and neat. And if we want to get past just looking at buildings and looking at structure and to try and understand people and their stories, as archaeologists, we really try to embrace that messiness to find meaning and value in the mess. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. If anyone has any questions, once again, just pop them into the Q&A. One thing about that really cool reconstruction, I assume that that's a particular date. Like, is that supposed to be in 79, or is it supposed to be during period 5, or what is it showing?
It's the 79.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the final phase. Yeah, it's it's a really kind of interesting process working with Gareth Blaney on this, because it's basically the last kind of project that we've done on this. Well, it's the last activity we've done on this project, right? Apart from the publication process, and it was just an interesting process to go through, because we thought we knew the site until we sat down with someone like Gareth Blaney and actually tried to reconstruct it and make it look like it might have looked like in 79 AD. And so it just was a great learning experience to go through that, and then a lot of fun too. So as Allison mentioned, it's it's built off the sort of data that from the ground level is sort of real and sort of accurate, as it were. Of course, as you go further up in the air, then you start to bring in different levels of ideas, interpretations, guesstimations, and the rest of it.
So we actually have one of our panelists, Lara Banducci, who has a question. And she says, how do you tell that a midden is shared or filled by two properties?
Yeah, so this was an instance in which we had a cesspit that was at the back of one building, and it's kind of a great big open building, and probably with a building with open space incorporated into it or behind it. That then later on, this space is divided into 2 buildings, but there's a wall that just comes up on both sides of the cesspit and meets it and stops. So the cesspit is still, it's very strange. And we kind of tried to puzzle it out, well, like which property does it belong to? But really it's pretty clear. The wall is coming up and abutting the top of this. It's kind of a stone built top of the cesspit. And it does seem to be open to both.
We have a question from Dan Diffendell. I have a question of interpretation. I'd be interested to know more about how you distinguish between the spaces you label as shops, bars, restaurants, and inns, and whether you'd say that's only been made possible by excavating an entire neighborhood.
Yeah, maybe Stephen should speak to this one.
Sorry, I missed the question. My internet's coming in and out. Sorry, I might have to call
I
you.
can jump in.
Sorry.
I can jump in then. Yeah, if it's so this is, of course, Stephen's area is in the area of retail. So basically bars, everything's kind of at shop or retail space, but bars have masonry counters in our definitions. Shops are shops without masonry counters. Inns are these kind of big spaces, and this is really going all the way back to Maiori here, these big spaces that allow entrance for carts. They have ramps up off of the street and stables at the back, so they seem to be used for renting carts, renting animals, or leaving them as you're coming into the city. And restaurants are these retail spaces that tend to have shops at the front, but then have these big sort of garden dining spaces at the back, even though they look like retail buildings, and also some indoor dining as well. So that's how we determine them. And as far as excavating an entire neighborhood, I think it certainly makes it easier to define these spaces. But like we said, the majority of the finds that we're working from are part of the construction, that they aren't actually part of the use of the space. So a lot of this determination is really made by the standing architecture that's still there rather than by the finds. Of course, the finds affect it, especially if we're talking about drains and cesspits. But yeah, that 94% number of what seems to just be trash that's come in from outside the walls and been used in construction means that it does limit what we can say about what's happening in each of these spaces.
There are some more questions, but I think we probably need to get on to Morgantina. I will say that all of the questions are being recorded, and the emails of the people who asked them and the names are being recorded, and those will be sent to all the panelists afterwards. So with that, let us go down to Sicily. And we will be hearing from Alex Walthall and Truetzel. So Alex, director of the Contrada Agnese project, is assistant professor of Greek and Roman archaeology in the Department of Classics at the University of Texas at Austin. And in addition to the Contrada Agnese project, he has directed excavation at the West Granary at Morgantina, and has participated in various Morgantina projects since he first joined the excavation back in 2003. And along with excavation reports that he's preparing, he's also working on a book based on his dissertation entitled A Measured Harvest, Grain Tithes and Territories in Hellenistic and Roman Sicily, 276 to 231 BCE. And Alex is a 2013 Rome Prize Fellow, in fact, the same cohort as Stephen Ellis. And Ann Truetzel is Director of Materials Management, and she's responsible for coordinating post-excavation processing of archaeological material, including ceramics, small finds, and paleobotanical and zoological remains. And she's been part of the project since 2013. She's currently an instructor in the classics department at Davidson College, and is about to complete her Princeton dissertation entitled Roman Women on the Home Front in the Second Punic War. So I will turn it over to you guys.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right. Okay, thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the whole AAR team for hosting this. And to be sort of brief and give an outline, I'm going to speak Annie will speak, I'll speak, Annie will speak, and we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit and give you a sense of what we've been working on for the past few years. So for those of us who aren't familiar with where Morgantina is, we're located here on the island of Sicily, right in the middle of the island, just about as far from the water as you can get. And we can talk more about that sort of later on. But we at the Contrada Agnese project are part of a much longer term excavation project, the American Excavations at Morgantina, which has been operating at Morgantina since 1955, first under the auspices of Princeton University and now the University of Virginia. And so we are continuing, I hope, sort of the legacy of excavation, adding our own interpretation, our own sort of developments in terms of methodology, research questions, so forth and so on. So participating very much in a big dig. Contrada Agnese is the area here highlighted in red. We are outside of, let's say, the urban core. We're still in the urban center, still in the city, but at the far western edge, away from the monuments and the houses that many of us who have visited Morgantina before, maybe as part of the Academy's summer school, would have visited in the Agora. So we're out here, and what brought us out to the far western edge of the city were a number of research questions. We wanted to explore and try to understand the daily lives of the sub-elite residents of Morgantina. Many of the houses that had been excavated in the 1950s, 1960s were these well-appointed aristocratic houses. And so our interest was try to get a different view on the city. In starting a new project, this was an opportunity for us to collect and analyze environmental data that had never been collected before at the site. And so while we have this incredible sort of archive of archaeological material and records stretching all the way back to 1955, there was a big question mark when it came sort of to the paleobotany and the ancient sort of environmental data. So this was a great opportunity for us, as well as incorporating a lot of the latest digital data management and dissemination practices and methodologies, many of which we benefited from in our collaboration with the other affiliated projects, both PARPS and Gabii. And then lastly, we wanted to continue to provide comprehensive training and research opportunities for students by making the project large enough that we could invite lots and lots of student volunteers over the years. So in 2014, excuse me, we started excavating the building that occupied the northwest lot of Insula West 1314 South Lot 1, highlighted here in blue. And between 2014 and 2019, we exposed the full extent of the building, which measures just over 500 square meters. And here's a shot from 2017 from our drone Tuna. Now that the dust of the excavation has settled, it's clear that we're looking at a house of the 3rd century BCE. And we'll talk more about the house in a moment. But what I want to emphasize, as Nick and Stephen had before, is that the results of all of this effort are nothing sort of the product of the work, the time, the energy of a small army of volunteers, of staff, of local workmen, of specialists, each of whom has contributed to the project in countless ways. And so I'm showing you just a few of the teams from the past few years, as well as our sponsors who have made this work possible, allowing these sort of incredible groups to get together and sort of problem solve throughout the summers. And so I'll turn it over to Annie now.
So in the interest of providing an insider's perspective on our project, I'm going to spend just the next couple of minutes outlining some of our methods with a focus on the project goals that Alex just talked about. So our staff and volunteers, which average about 40 to 50 in number each year, work on 7 different teams. And while excavation is obviously the focus of the largest number of our team members, there are also dedicated positions for both staff and student volunteers on the geospatial, data, fine, ceramics, conservation, and environmental teams. And as you'll notice here, Our teams work in 3 discrete locations, from the archaeological site of Morgantina to lab and dig house spaces in the modern town of Idonae, where we live, and which is about a 10 to 15 minute drive away from the archaeological site. So as a result, one of our biggest challenges is communication. And our digital database, which was designed by Lee Lieberman and partially modeled on that of Stephen's team at PARPS, has been really invaluable in facilitating real-time collaboration between the dispersed teams. I just wanted to give you a few shots of it so you could see kind of how it works, and if there are any questions about specifics, we can handle those later. So using tablets, excavators in the field have live access to the database, as well as the latest orthorectified plans of the site and photogrammetric models of recently excavated contexts that are produced by our great geospatial team, which is led by James Huemeler and Ben Gorham. So data on each newly excavated context are entered into the database in the field and then inform the work of the teams in the lab as they process the excavated material. As each artifact is treated, photographed, and preliminarily analyzed, often we aim to do that within about a day. This information becomes immediately available to excavators through the database. So here you can see one of the coins that is very important for dating, and that you can see that we looked at the contact sheet on the previous slide, and here you can see what the finds team did in the lab. And then even dating information populates on the original context sheet. So there is almost immediate kind of feedback on all of the material that is produced that is accessible to everyone in the project. And having centralized access to real-time data has helped our team in quickly developing our interpretations of the house over the course of individual seasons. And maybe most critically, it has allowed us to continue our analysis of the house remotely in the midst of the pandemic, when we were unexpectedly unable to return to Sicily in person, even though we're at a stage in the project where we're continuing our analytical work. So as Alex mentioned, collection of environmental data has been a priority for us from the beginning. And our environmental team, led by China Shelton and Michael McKinnon, collected phytolith samples from various parts of the Contrada Agnese and floated soil samples from each context of the house. And this work has produced thousands of animal bones and carbonized seeds, which Alex will discuss in more detail shortly. These archaeobotanical and faunal remains are joined by nearly 100,000 ceramic sherds that were analyzed by our ceramics team led by Kat Baker, as well as more than 4,000 artifacts that have been collected and processed by the finds team under the guidance of Molly Schottheim. And together, these remains, coming from one house, but quite a substantial amount of material, they represent the most comprehensive data set of archaeological material that has been collected from a household at Morgantina. Now, while collecting this data, we've continued the AEM tradition of providing comprehensive training and research opportunities for students. So in addition to the specialized instruction that students receive throughout the season on their individual teams, each volunteer participates in our Day in Town, Day in the Field program, in which they spend a day shadowing, learning from, and assisting the staff from the other teams. And through this experience, several students who began working at CAP as excavators discovered their interest in post-excavation processing, and then returned in subsequent seasons to work on finds, environmental, and ceramics teams. And in fact, some of these students have gone on to pursue postgraduate degrees focusing on these specialties and are now contributing to publishing the results of our project, a topic that we'll spend the rest of this talk discussing.
So, what is this house? We have come to sort of give the house the name, the House of the Two Mills, because yes, we found these 2 rotary mills inside the complex, and you'll hear more about the mills and their use from Annie in a moment. What I want to focus on is to say that while no fewer than 24 houses have been excavated at Morgantina already in the past 65 years, the House of the Two Mills is the first to be excavated from start to finish using modern excavation techniques and methodologies. So we've captured a wide range of material evidence related to ancient diet, household economy, craft production, ritual activity. And as Annie said, this has allowed us to reach a level of analytical detail in our discussions of domestic space at Morgantina that weren't previously possible. So we're going to try to highlight a few of those now. Before that, I just want to say that the House of the Two Mills belongs to a transformative moment in the history of Morgantina, when during the 3rd century BCE, the city experienced a moment of economic prosperity and demographic growth, which is probably due to its political subordination to the Syracusan king Huron II. And belonging to Huron's kingdom meant that Morgantina was kind of safe from the violence of the First and Second Punic Wars, which we think allowed the city to flourish. So the House of the Two Mills is very much a product of this historical moment, in that we see that its occupation reflects many of the opportunities and limitations placed upon the city and its residents during this period. Also, in the sense that its life cycle, right, really lasted for no more than 60 years, from occupation, construction, abandonment, and destruction, all between about 260 and 200 BCE. And while this is sort of a sort of frustratingly narrow window of time archaeologically, we've been able to kind of parse out a number of phases. So I want to just walk through a few of the phases now, so we get a sense, because one of the big sort of discoveries of ours, or not discoveries, but let's say, one of the big breakthroughs was the degree of change, the dynamism within the architecture and the use of the space, which I think sometimes gets lost when we have publications that, for instance, from Morgantina, right, that are dealing with material from the 1950s and 1960s. Now we can really get a sense, I think, of the change taking place. So in phase one, which is just about 10 years, we think, we see kind of a rows of rooms arranged around a big courtyard. And one of the salient distinguishing features of this phase is a search for water, an interest in water. And we have no fewer than 3 kind of hydraulic installations, cisterns, a possible well that was abandoned, large settling basins that are being excavated inside the courtyard in various rooms right in this earliest phase. And so we're thinking that this is possibly due, again, to one of these negative consequences of the rapid growth of the city, and that as the city expands so rapidly, they begin to pave over their recharge area, limiting the amount of fresh water. So individual households are now left, right, to fend for themselves in a sense and collect water in their own lots. The excavation of these hydraulic features has also revealed one of the most exciting discoveries, if not sort of visually breathtaking. But everyone sit down for a minute. Here, the appropriately named Idonae Mechanism, as I show you some sort of glamour shots of it, was found at the bottom of one of these cisterns or wells that was never finished its construction. But what we have here possibly are a few links of the earliest attested, as far as I can tell, gear-driven drive chain. Think of a big bicycle chain that we have descriptions of from the 3rd century BC and authors like Philo of Byzantium, but no physical remains of. So possibly, here we are right at the bottom of this well in this lot in the middle of nowhere. In the second phase, the occupants of the house seem to sort of acquire a little more wealth, and we see a little DIY monumentalization. And in part, we see the construction of a small, almost like a pastas, with the installation of a number of columns that were formed of terracotta bricks stacked on one another and then coated in plaster, and possibly the incorporation of some nicer column capitals. And here you see a Doric capital that was found inside our building, although not associated with the columns, as you see, that had collapsed. The third phase of the building, we see a further subdivision. This is the final phase of occupation, the further subdivision of the open courtyard into a number of small spaces. And here in phase 3, just as I think in phase 5 at Pompeii, we can begin to talk about use in a more realistic sense, because here we have deposits that were left on floors around the time of the abandonment and destruction. And room 7, we see the installation of what might be a small bath complex, a little bathroom here with a hip bath, a large bacino a capanna kind of style basin, and a hearth. So why go to the public baths when you could bring the baths home? And also from the area of room 8 and room 11, we have evidence for food production, for cooking. We found the remains of a hearth with vast amounts of, again, this environmental data, archaeobotanical material, faunal remains. And so I show you just a few here, along with the butchered remains of red deer, which tell us again about sort of the larger surrounding environment of Morgantina at the time. So I'll turn it over back to Annie now.
Yes, so in phase 3, we see a lot of reorganization of space, as Alex alluded to, and that continues as well in the northwest corner of the house in rooms 1 and 2. So doorways that once connected room 1 with the rooms to the east and to the south were filled in at this point in time with rubble and plastered over, making the room accessible only from the avenue outside to the north. And room 2A received similar treatment in this final phase of occupation when a doorway was cut into the northern wall of the room to likewise give it direct access to the main avenue. And this room, on the other hand, remained accessible from the interior of the house as well. So to us, these architectural modifications suggested that the rooms may have been converted into commercial spaces at this time. And this inference is supported by the assemblage of finds discovered from these rooms. So for example, we found the remains of a mostly complete pithos used for storage of perhaps grain, as we'll see, or flour. It was found lying on the floor of room 1 together with a vessel, you can see at the bottom, that is used for measuring dry goods. And the remains of another large pithos were found in room 2A, as well as a second measuring vessel and 2 lead trade weights that you can see here, as well as dozens of small denomination bronze coins. And indeed, a kernel density analysis of coin finds reveals that a disproportionately large concentration of coins were recovered from room 2 in comparison to other areas of the house. So taken together, this suggests to us that these rooms were used as shops run by either the inhabitants of the house or, in the case of room 1, perhaps even rented to someone outside the family. And this is a phenomenon that is probably best well known from Roman sites like Pompeii. We just heard Allison and Stephen talk about the shops there. But if our interpretation is correct, our house does provide an important example of a similar use of space in a Greek house, joining some other examples from Morgantina, as well as from Delos and Olynthus. So what is being sold in these shops, you may ask? Maybe flour. So as the name of our building indicates, and as Alex said, there were 2 rotary mills that were found in our house, one in room 11B and the other in room 13. And both mills were found on floor surfaces associated with the final phase of the house's occupation, implying that they were functioning up until the point of the building's abandonment. You can see the one from room 11B here. Our interpretation is that operating just one rotary mill would have pretty easily generated flour for the immediate needs of the household. So if both mills were indeed in operation simultaneously, as it seems, output could have been scaled to a larger urban market and may have formed some of the goods that were sold in these shops in the other part of the house. Another kind of consideration here is that other millstones of an earlier type, the so-called hopper rubber or Olynthus type, were also found in our house. But these objects had been retired from their primary use as mills and were instead repurposed as construction material in the building's floors and walls. And that presumably happened because the development of the new and more efficient rotary mill rendered the earlier type obsolete. So, hey, why not reuse it? For our purposes, though, it's striking that the occupants of this house appear to have invested in different milling technologies over several phases of occupation. And that sustained investment maybe gives us even more reason to think that flour production in the house could have reached a commercial scale. And lastly, one area of the house to note is the courtyard in room 15. As we've seen, this area became smaller and smaller over time as portions of it were divided into separate rooms, a phenomenon that we've just heard about at Pompeii as well. But several notable finds were recovered from the surface of its final smaller iteration. And among these are the fragments of a large cylindrical terracotta altar that you can see at the top right here. That is about 50 centimeters in diameter, and it's of a type that is commonly encountered in 3rd century contexts at Morgantina, as well as at sites around Sicily, particularly in the eastern half of the island. And the state of preservation of this altar, we have almost all of the fragments from a very contained area on the surface of the courtyard, suggests that it may have been originally used within the house itself rather than deposited as fill. Also in the courtyard, lying not far away from this larger altar, excavators found additional altars, 2 of them, each of a cylindrical form, but miniature in size. And the small scale of these suggests they may have been used for rituals involving incense burning or maybe small offerings of food. So collectively, this concentration of altars maybe indicates that the courtyard served as a locus for ritual activity in the house, at least during the final occupation phase. And that would accord well with depictions of household religious practice that we found in ancient Greek literature, for example. And lastly, as you can see in the top and bottom pictures on the right here, there were mingled among the smaller altars 3 mold-made terracotta figurines that were lying quite close to one another. And most remarkably, they were just alongside the small spool-like bases on which the figurines were originally displayed. You can see those just to the right of each figurine. All 3 figurines represent female figures dressed in fine drapery and were originally decorated with colorful pigments and in one case gold leaf. So while thousands of terracotta figurines have been discovered in the course of excavations at Morgantina, very few have been found together with their bases. And our figurines from the courtyard therefore shed kind of light on the use and display of the objects within the context of an ancient household. And moreover, even though none of the 3 figurines is explicitly a divinity that we can tell from their attributes, their association with the miniature altars maybe raises the question of whether the objects were related to ritual activity within the household.
Excellent. Thanks, Annie. So that's just a little, brief taste of what we've been finding and how we're starting to kind of process this this information and material. Our excavations stopped, as everyone else's, I think, in 2019. We couldn't go back last year, and so we're now in kind of a publication mode, taking a lot of cues from our 2 affiliated projects at the Academy. If you would like to see where we are now, we've been publishing annual preliminary reports with the FASTI online, and we're working on now sort of the final publication volumes as we sort of piece all of this back together. But you could check out more about the project on our website. And again, I just want to thank Annie and everyone here on this panel for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you both. I see we already have a question for you. This is from CM Pyle. Regarding the altars, are the altars to series, which would sort of imply flower shop or granary, or do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no great way to tell from the material that we have within our house who the divinity was or divinities that were being worshipped at these altars. The figurines that we have, for instance, are not obviously of any particular gods or goddesses, and there's no inscriptional evidence, for instance, that would clarify that. However, that said, Demeter and Kore were extremely important goddesses that were worshipped in a number of kind of small sanctuaries throughout the area of Morgantina, and kind of grain production was very important to the economy of Morgantina throughout its history. So it's not unreasonable to suppose that they would have been important goddesses for this kind of household as well. Alex, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Only to add that that's a great question to ask one of our field supervisors, Andrew Tharler, who completed his dissertation a few years ago on these altars. And has been doing some really important work, I think, in terms of domestic religion. So Andrew is currently at Duke University.
So I have a question for you guys. Your house is, you're one of my favorite Morgantina buildings, Bath B.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about the context of that area? Because there's like 2 bath buildings right around there, aren't there? So I'm just wondering how this house making grain fits in with these 2 bath buildings.
So at our intersection, just for everyone who can sort of imagine, sort of at the intersection between one of the main avenues, Platea B, where our shops run onto, and the cross street, West 14th, at least 4 different buildings, including our house, have been excavated sporadically and now more intensely in the sort of the last decade, and then sporadically since the 1970s. And so we have two monumental public bath buildings, which are being studied by Sandra Lucore, and then another house, just sort of 2 hour southwest, the House of the Two Skeletons, admittedly a cooler name than the Two Mills, that's been studied by our colleague Monica Trumper. And what I think collectively have come to realize is that, at least in terms of the chronology, this entire neighborhood, and this gets back again to speaking of this moment at Morgantina and the house being a product of its historical moment, is that all of the buildings that we've excavated so far are all constructed right around the same time, in about 260, let's say. And preceding that, there seems to be some sort of major construction event that actually, Laura, involves quarrying. So we have a lot of quarrying out there, a clearing back of this entire kind of neighborhood, and then all of the sort of the buildings rising together. The baths obviously are, you know, they need the water, right? They're going to sort of, you know, absorb as much water as they can. Obviously Sandra would be better sort of, would be more apt to speak to this, but the North Bath, which I supervised excavations at for a while, had a number of different sort of hydraulic interventions as well. So they were digging wells to access water, as well as collecting it from the roof, just like we were as well. The shops, and Annie can sort of speak to this, I mean, they are oriented immediately across the street from the entrances and exits to the bath. And in one of the later phases of our building, the occupants seem to have constructed a long bench along the north face that fronts onto the platea. So it's possible that if the bath were full, you could sit at the bench. There's a little water feature right outside of our house, maybe bought a snack. It's all speculative, but that's the fun.
Okay, thank you. So Glenview has a question, and you've answered part of it. So it's what is the immediately surrounding area of this house like? But he also asked, has the Idonae Mechanism been published? And I have the same question because that is so cool.
So the Idonae Mechanism has not yet been published, so please don't snake us on that. But it's been already presented by my colleague Raven Taylor, partially at a conference, and we are sort of in the process of doing more research and studying it. But you'll all be the first to know and get that information out there. No, so it is quite exciting, and again, what it was doing at the bottom of this sort of aborted cistern well is hard to say. You know, was it part of the lifting for soil? Was it, you know, for possibly water from the baths? You know, it's difficult to say. And I think, to speak to Allison's point, you know, this comes from a fill, and I think one that was probably, we know it was accumulated immediately as the cistern was abandoned. So does possibly bear some connection to what's happening in the Contrada Agnese, if not just in our house in that moment in time. So hopefully soon, the Idonae Mechanism, and help us make that name stick, because Antikythera Mechanism gets all the hype, right?
Oh, right.
So,
and yours is easier to say.
Exactly.
So we only have 15 minutes left. So I think I'd like to open it up a little bit. So Glenview was also the one who asked the question, how many years does an excavation need to qualify as a big dig? Some sites are huge. Do you simply stop because it's gotten too big? And I think I'm going to direct that to Nick, because he has done a lot of thinking about big digs. And I just want to give a shout out that Glenview is the first classics professor I ever had, and he's the reason that I started studying this stuff.
Yeah, okay. No, it's a terrific question. And I mean, it's not like there are attestations of being a big dig, or, you know, a medium dig or a small dig that are given out. I think that the big dig, you know, in as much as it is a category, and you know, its you know, its boundaries are necessarily blurred, I would say that it's a methodological approach more than anything else, meaning that just like, archaeological fieldwork can range from field survey to, test trenches or shovel tests, deep sondages, boreholes, and on and on. The big dig is really most big digs, I would say, are contiguous large areas developed over a number of years, that where the sense is that there is going to be a buildup of know-how in terms of local ceramics, in terms of local building techniques, in terms of soil matrix, and so on and so forth, so that there is a benefit compared to starting at another site or even another part at the same site. And I am, in my defense, partial defense of big digs for the 21st century, I want to emphasize that I don't think that they are the best way of doing archaeological fieldwork, but simply that they are one possible way. Then they probably should stay in our arsenal, because there was a moment, especially late 90s, early aughts, where they came under reasonable fire from people like Greg Wolf or Lisa Fentress, understandably so. And I think that it's not really justifiable to continue doing them like they were being done in the 20th century, but that methodology and the benefits justify updating that approach, that methodological approach, to the 21st century.
Let's see. This is from Massimo Botello, and this is for the Porta Stabia project. Have you been able to understand the extent of the running water distribution in the private residences? In other words, how many houses, but especially bars and restaurants, had running water and did not need to use the public fountains nearby? Thank you for the 3 clear presentations.
Yeah, I can jump in. This is an easy one to answer. None of them had piped water, but they did have complex systems of cisterns. So they were very heavily using cisterns even after the aqueduct brings water into Pompeii. And there is a fountain in the neighborhood too, just inside the Porta Stabia.
Mm-hmm. So I want to take it to sort of a different place. Stephen was one of the earliest people to start using iPads at the Porta Stabia. And I mean, just the whole technology for all 3 projects has changed tremendously, even just, since 2013, when I think Alex started this project, the Contrada project. The technology has just changed so much in that short time. The other 2 projects are even a little bit longer. Stephen, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that has affected running a dig, particularly for multiple years.
It's I think about this a lot, not just because when I'm sitting here looking at these 2 great other projects that have been using all this great technology and having these great ideas since 2012, when we stopped doing our excavations, right? You can see the results you get from that. The benefit of it's not just paperless recording with something like an iPad, but things like photogrammetry and photogrammetric recording, 3D recording, and I think even drones, especially drones as well, make a huge difference to the record. So I think, it was interesting. I mean, the story of the iPads was certainly interesting at the time. Because it made a big difference to a lot of projects at the time in terms of going paperless and really kind of changing the way that we were able to be sort of a bit more efficient with our work. I mean, archaeological field work is just so naturally inefficient, and there are pros and cons to that. It's not all bad. There are some good sides to that inefficiency sometimes. But when I look at what's happening in sort of more recent years, I think the impact of these new technological changes are just impacting a lot more areas of these fieldwork projects. And so I guess I look at that from the perspective of having this new project at Tharos in Sardinia that we started digging in 2019. So there was that period between 2012 and 2019. But of course, our colleagues here could speak more knowledgeably to it than I can, having had that little gap in there. How it impacts everything, I think, in terms of labor, it certainly changes the kinds of things you do on site in terms of field work. It changes the kinds of post-ex activities that we do. And it really has impacted not just the quality of information, not even just the quantity of information, but also the way that you can engage different kinds of people on a project as well, I think is making a big difference. I guess what I'm speaking to there is that a lot of these technologies are no longer just sort of in the hands of that micro specialist who can use that one machine that goes ping. We still have few of those machines that do that. And we still have a few of those specialists, but I think a lot of these new tools are being used by a lot more people. And so that's kind of changing the dynamic of how we do our field work, I think.
I was really struck by Anne and Alex when you were talking about how you have some people in the lab and some people on the site, and then they're actually logging into the same database, and like things are changing in real time and they're communicating. It's just really amazing.
I think, again, speaking from the Porta Stabia and the Tharos examples, but I know that this must be shared with the other groups, but it was that level of communication that really changed. And that was one of the surprises that I personally had. When we first got into things like iPads, you could sort of anticipate some of the advantages you would get from having a computer sort of in the trench and having sort of access to data and all that kind of stuff was all sort of fairly obvious and to be anticipated. What I didn't realize was the extent to which communication would just improve tenfold. Within the course of a day, across the project, sort of at night, after work, in the off seasons, just really trying to change the whole dynamic that way. It's great.
With Gabii, I'm wondering. I mean, you guys are probably the biggest of the three here. Do you have a similar kind of thing that Anne and Alex are doing?
Yeah, there is a unified sort of real-time database, which involves, in the case of Gabii, running a local internet hub, local Wi-Fi, because it's impossible otherwise to have all the various devices synced up with the kind of very poor, general regular internet coverage you get at Gabii. But yeah, and I think that's definitely one aspect, because it makes the data collection much more error-free than with asynchronous databases. The other element that really made a big difference for us, and I think that it is crucial to the timely publications of these large data sets, is the collection of data already in formats that are public facing, so that instead of, because once you start creating a whole lot of shorthand codes that you use, then the migration of these data sets to the online publication that we have, it can be enormously time consuming. So I think that if you start now or going forward, projects need to think of their data collection not simply as an internal tool, but also as something that can be turned out. And we are considering the possibility of doing that in real time. And our database is already available. Our entire database is available, not just the parts that we've published. But you could get to a point where our data collection would be available in real time. And of course, all that would, the difference being that you have, different users have different levels of permissions.
I know a number of you have mentioned the importance of photogrammetry to your work process. I mean, obviously, photogrammetry. I'm just thinking maybe of Lara's showing the tombs and the different phases of the tombs. It's great for explaining to the public what you're doing. But I'm wondering how does it help you understand the site yourself? Not presenting it to the public, but how does it affect your own understanding of the site?
There's a number of different ways to answer that question. I think the first one that comes to mind, though, is in the context of a big dig when so many people are working together, not all of whom were on that particular corner of the site on that particular day when that feature was excavated. It helps in that post-excavation process. There are benefits to 2D photography, but that 3D layer of a photograph, I think, really helps in our interpretation of the site in the post-excavation phase.
Yeah.
If you didn't see that particular wall before it was deconstructed in order to get to the feature underneath it, et cetera, I think that's one of the ways that photogrammetry can really help in the research realm.
Anybody else have any?
If I can add to that, if I may, we've had the same experience here with looking at the photogrammetry. I mean, we were putting on the final touches of our Pompeii publication at the same time as dealing with our first season's results from Tharos, where we had photogrammetry, and it really hadn't dawned on me just that value yet of being able to revisit a trench and to get back into a trench at pretty much any time of day from an entire season. So we often talk about photogrammetry as being 3D, and we sort of we infer that 3D is so great, or we talk about, or we show these like really good images of the photogrammetric sort of record, and that's all good and great and nice to present. What I found really useful with the photogrammetry was being able to sort of get into any trench, any day, morning, noon, or afternoon, and see it just in the process as well. So from my mind, it was just that ability to basically to revisit the experiment, which I think is probably the biggest value of the photogram so far for mine.
So I'm assuming the one that Lara showed us, I'm assuming it's a lower resolution for Zoom, and that when you're using it for these purposes, you have a much higher resolution to use.
Yeah, those ones were also 10 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
Those ones, when they were taken, they took all day to process, essentially, right? Now we create photo models and they take 20 minutes to mesh, to be created. So
yeah,
it's a very different ballgame.
In 2009, laptops would be left at the academy and the 5B, and they would crunch all weekend, and then the model would be ready Monday morning.
Wow. So that's the service that we provide, the crunching place. Well, guys, Anne, go ahead.
I was just going to say about photogrammetry. I mean, our project has explored also doing photogrammetry of individual finds, which I know, Lara, you guys have pioneered. And in fact, you taught me how to do it at a program at the Academy several years ago. But it has kind of brought out for specific kinds of finds, like reconstructing fragments of an altar into a fully three-dimensional structure that you can see from all dimensions. We had a small, like miniature lead vessel that was embossed or stamped, and it was completely illegible until we did a photogrammetric model, and then we're able to read the inscription on it. So, I mean, it's both at the level of trenches and stratigraphic units, but also for small finds that I think all of the projects are thinking increasingly about how to use this tool in different ways.
So I do want to give a plug for the course that Lara ran. Lara, could you say just two words about, it was a 1-week course, I believe, before
Yeah, this was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. Rachel Oppitz and I ran this 1-week workshop. I think it will be a bit longer in future on digital curation of artifacts. So it really was focusing on photogrammetry as one of the skills to be taken away from that, but it was also thinking more broadly about digital data management of artifacts, thinking about small finds in particular, and research around small finds, reporting of small finds is sort of the way that we can think about writing catalog entries and dissemination of that research and linking those pieces of information to larger questions within excavations. But the sort of skill was particularly focused on 3D models, and we were using a lot of artifacts from Gabii in storage at the Academy as a sort of case study practice for that.
Well, we have run out of time. This has been awesome, guys. Thank you so much for participating, for doing the work that you've done, and particularly I'm just amazed at your organizational skills and being able to organize such numbers of people with different skills. And I find it mind-blowing, and I'm envious of those of you who can put things like that together. I also just want to say, as far as I know, this is the last public event that I will be moderating as Mellon Professor. I want to thank Bernie Frischer again for his contribution for this. And I just really want to say it's a delight to go out with this group of people. You know, I've had 3 years at the American Academy now, and it's really nice to be able to go out with the affiliated excavation. So thanks very much for agreeing to do this.
And if I may add by the end,
Thank you, Lynn.
if I may add some words by the end, thank you so much for the all panelists, and thank you for the whole, you know, contribution, your contribution to the big digs. And I'm also would like to thank my colleague Lynn, who devotedly moderates this Zoom events and conversation over the 3 years here at the Academy. I also, you know, want to welcome you when in a better time after COVID, and to see you all a presto in Roma, in the American Academy. And I know that the sky behind Lynn will remain eternally blue, but mine is just showing that we are over the sunset. So buonasera a tutti and a presto. Grazie.
Grazie.
Thanks again, guys.
Grazie.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.